One of the, I guess, quotes you hear more often than anything else, is this one, right? And not only do we hear it, but we see various kind of pictures depicting it. Some, pretty clever ones, some more modern, some older, and it all looks really neat, right? I mean, it's pretty clever artwork, and you get the message, that really food is the only material that ever goes into our body. So yes, we are what we eat. There are also some others which are somewhat more questionable. I actually showed this one at a medical conference, and someone took objection to it because of the depiction, that we blame people who are overweight for eating too much. Well, I don't think that that's what that picture represents. I think what it does represent is that what we put into our body does have an effect on our body. And by and large, it is true that people who are overweight have very, very poor diets. So I think it's okay to look at that picture. Anyway, the quote is all over the place. If you look at scientific journals, there is an article, a recent one, and again, you are what you eat. In this case, with a different take on it. Here, the message is that the microbes in our gut, which you're hearing about a lot these days, the so-called microbiome, which play a role in our health, well, their existence depends on what we eat. And we've talked before about probiotics, prebiotics, and all of that. So that's what that article is about. And if you go on Amazon and you want to look for a book on You Are What You Eat, there are many. There are dozens of them. This is just a partial list of all the books that, with the title, You Are What You Eat. So certainly this is, quite a widespread idea. Well, the reason that I bring this up is because we're going to ask the question, where does it come from? Where does this quote, "You are what you eat," originate, which we now hear all over the place? It's not so easy to track this down, but I think we do have some clues. I think when we go back all the way to the 1800s and Jean-Antoine Briand-Savarin, who was a French lawyer, philosopher, but eventually became known as a gourmand. And he was the first one to write a book about not only recipes, but the delights of eating. And that was called Physiologie du goût, that is the physiology of taste. And it really was the first book that looked at eating in a scientific fashion. And in this book, we have a quote which isn't exactly "You are what you eat," but this is the first time that we encounter something like that. Tell me what you eat and I will tell you who you are. Well, there has been much debate about what he actually meant by that. Whether it was referring to physical food that you put into your body, or whether it was referring to that you can tell someone's social status by what their diet is, right? Because in those days, if you had a large varied diet, you were likely to be upper class. If you lived on gruel, like in Oliver Twist, then you were likely to be in lower class. So I think he had that in mind. However, we do know that he did have a scientific inclination also, because in the book, he certainly talks about the devilish aspects of white flour and sugar. Really, this was quite early on in the 1800s. And in those days, nobody else was talking about the detrimental effects of this part of the diet. I mean, sugar was prized. Sugar was an expensive commodity at that time in Europe, and you were lucky if you were to get it. So Briand-Savarin's arguments against eating white flour and sugar were quite novel at that time. But I think the first time that really encounter a strong quote about you are what you eat, which really referred to nutritional aspect of food, was in 1922. And amazingly enough, it was in an ad. And the ad was for Fleischmann's yeast. And your strength and vigor depend on what you eat. Our strength, vigor, health, and even the span of life itself depend on what we eat. This is one of the most startling discoveries of modern science. It's a pretty interesting ad. First of all, it's interesting that the ad actually, has so much writing in it and actually talks about the science. If you look at the last paragraph there, many of the things we eat have lost their valuable food properties through refining and other such commercial preparation. Well, don't we hear that virtually every day today? You have articles emerging daily about the evils of ultra-processed foods, right? This is way back in 1922. So again, your strength and vigor depend on what you eat. It's pretty close to you are what you eat, right? Well, anyway, what they were selling here was yeast. Yeast is a living organism. It is made up of microscopic cells, which you can only see through the microscope, right? That's what we're looking at here. We're looking at yeast cells. But as you know, the function of yeast, in a simple way, is to produce carbon dioxide and alcohol. That's what this little organism does. It takes in generally sugar as a food, and through a series of chemical reactions, converts it into alcohol and carbon dioxide. And when we're using yeast in baking, then of course what we're making use of is the fact that it generates carbon dioxide. This is what makes the dough rise, right? That's why we use it in baking. Now the history of yeast is very interesting because it goes back to the 1800s, and it goes back to a Jewish Hungarian immigrant to the United States by the name of Charles Fleischmann. Fleischmann had learned all about baking back in Hungary and in Prague and in Vienna, where he apprenticed to a baker. And when he came to America, he found that the bread that the Americans were eating was pretty poor quality, and he thought that he could improve on that by selling yeast that he had brought back from Europe. Anyway, he founded a company and began to sell Fleischmann's yeast, which became very popular. He was pretty good at advertising, and those were the delivery trucks that delivered Fleischmann's yeast pretty soon all across the country. And not only was it sold as an instrument to make bread rise, but also as a health product. Fleischmann's yeast, it's healthful. Eat 3 cakes a day. 3, sort of square blocks of yeast. It became a huge industry. The factory that was built was very large, and the first time that yeast was widely advertised to the public was at the Philadelphia 1878 exhibition. And people were invited to come and try the yeast. And as you can see, Vienna Model Bakery is what it was called, because he had learned how to use yeast way back in Vienna. And the Fleischmann empire was huge. The factory where Fleischmann's yeast was made was one of the largest manufacturing enterprises in the United States. And then the company went into something that most people don't know, because there is, of course, another product that you could make with yeast besides bread, and they figured that out. So all of a sudden, Fleischmann's distilled gin was born, because they were in the process of making yeast. That was their big product. So why not also use the yeast to ferment sugar and make alcoholic beverages? which of course did. There's an ad for it, and it became a big seller. And Fleischmann and the whole family became immensely rich. And there is today a village in Upper New York State, in the Catskills, which is Fleischmann's New York. And it is named after Fleischmann. Now, therein lies a very interesting story. During the late 1800s, anti-Semitism in the United States was quite extensive. And Fleischmann was perturbed by the fact that he was not allowed into some hotels in New York. That was happening in the late 1800s. So he decided to build his own resort, and that was in the Catskills. And he built himself a mansion, as you can see, a city in itself, as they called it. And that was the beginning of the Borscht Belt, the whole movement in the Catskills. And numerous other hotels were built. Unfortunately, not many of them have survived. But this became a refuge for Jews, mostly from New York. This is where they could go and spend their summers, where there would be no worry about anti-Semitism. And of course, they had to be entertained there in several ways. Obviously, they had to be fed, which is number one. And they also had to be entertained. And that's when the Borscht Belt comedians came to life. And there's a marker there, as you can see. From the 1920s through the early 1970s, Borscht Belt was a preeminent summer resort destination for hundreds of predominantly East Coast American Jews. And that was really, really something. And I was exposed to this. Now, this would be back in the early 1960s, or maybe late 1960s, when we went to the Catskills. I wanted to see what this was like. And we went to Kutcher's. Any of you remember Kutcher's? Who was there? Ah, okay. Well, this was one of the famous resorts in the Catskills, and it really was quite a place. I mean, I remember at that time being amazed by the swimming pool, which was very large, and the whole place was very classy. But of course, the prime entertainment, without a doubt, was the dining room. And what I remember is that this really was an all-inclusive thing, so that the food was included in the price of staying there, and you could eat as much as you want. And of course, a lot of people made great use of that opportunity, and you had really good food. Here's a menu, as you can see. And what I remember is the waiter would bring you something and said, well, taste it. If you don't like it, we'll bring you another one. And you know, by the end of the meal, the tables were full of plates half eaten, because people would want to try. So, you know, they'd have one, then they said, well, bring me another one of this, they bring me another one of that. It really was gluttony. But the entertainment at night was really good. There were top-notch comedians there, and the one that I remember, because the week that we were at Kutcher's, he was the entertainer, was Malzy Lawrence. Anybody remember him? He was good. He was good. But of course, the Borscht Belt gave birth to many, many of the comedians that we're familiar with. Take a look at this list. All of these, starting from Abbott and Costello to Woody Allen, to Billy Crystal. I mean, all of these, you take a look at these names, these are the superstars of comedy. And Don Rickles, Carl Reiner, you know, Rona Martin, Gene Wilder, Henny Youngman, of course. All of them got their start in the Catskills. And eventually, of course, they went on to other places. And the comedy at that time was comedy that would not fly today. So, you know, it was a totally different era. Social mores were very different. So I'll give you a couple of the jokes that were told then. Okay, but you have to understand that this was the 1960s. These are not jokes that would be told today, because many of them were all about marital relationships, with usually the wife being the butt end of the joke. I've been in love with the same woman for 49 years. If my wife ever finds out, she'll kill me. What are the 3 words a woman never wants to hear when she's making love? Honey, I'm home. That's actually very good, right? She was at the beauty shop for 2 hours. That was only for the estimate. She got a mud pack and looked great for 2 days. Then the mud fell off. Big controversy on the Jewish view of when life begins. In Jewish tradition, the fetus is not considered viable until it graduates from medical school. Jewish boy comes home from school and tells his mother he has a part in the play. She asks, what part is it? The boy says, I play the part of Jewish husband. Mother scowls and says, go back, tell them to give you a speaking part. From Rodney Dangerfield, my wife and I were happy for 20 years, then we met. And then, of course, there's this classic line was, take my wife, please. My wife drowned in the pool because she was wearing so much jewelry. That's Don Rickles. My wife ain't too bright. One day our car got stolen. I said to her, did you get a look at the guy? She said, no, but I got the license number. This morning the doorbell rang. I said, who is it? She said, it's the Boston Strangler. I said, it's for you, dear. Well, I mean, obviously today these would be considered, you know, pretty tasteless and would never tell jokes like that. But it just goes to show you how different, you know, the era was. So the Catskills really were quite something. And most people don't really realize that the whole Catskills area was what Fleischmann's yeast built. That's what started it all. And we have other relics. The movie Dirty Dancing, which is, of course, a very good movie, that was modeled on, you know, what was going on in the Catskills. I think here the screenwriter supposedly stayed at Grossinger's, which was one of the top hotels. Unfortunately, all of those hotels now are gone, and they've been replaced by gambling resorts and yoga retreats and God knows what else. So that era is totally gone. Now, talking about yeast, there's another version of yeast which is interesting to talk about, and that is Marmite. A truly frightening concoction. This was manufactured first by Justus von Liebig, who in the 1800s was probably the top chemist in the world. And he was also the father of food science. And so he used an extract of yeast to come up with this thing called Marmite, which the Brits, for some unexplained reason, love. And usually you put it on toast. First you butter the toast, and then you put just a little bit of this Marmite on it. The taste is sort of indescribable. I mean, it's salty and vile, and you know, I don't know how they like it, but they do. It has a lot of glutamic acid, which is, of course, essentially another form of monosodium glutamate. So it does have some taste. It's, I guess, something that you have to grow up with, you have to learn to love. But it is also marketed because of the B vitamins that it contains. And it does contain, as you can see, it has niacin, folic acid. The vitamin B12 in this case is added. It does not, Marmite does not naturally have, it's a yeast extract, it does not naturally have vitamin B12. So anyway, it's an interesting kind of concoction. Is there anybody who likes it? No. Who has tasted it? Oh, you actually like it? What? Yeah, I have tried to like it, but not possible. There's another version of this, which from Australia called Vegemite. Very, very similar. I think it's a bit better tasting. So anyway, interesting enough, so this whole, this expression, you are what you eat, takes us all the way back to 1922 and, that advertisement by Fleischmann. And then in 1923, this is the first time that we actually see word for word, you are what you eat. And it was in an advertisement where a nutritional guru at the time, who had really no education, he was sort of the food babe of that era, Victor Lindlar, and he was quoted in this ad for a meat market, 90% of the diseases known to man are caused by cheap foodstuff. You are what you eat. Interesting, this 1923, and this is the kind of stuff that we hear today. Well, actually, Lindlar went on to write a number of books, but the one that I really trying to bring to your attention here is the one that was actually entitled, You Are What You Eat. So this is really where this whole idea was launched, that you are what you eat. And it was a book that basically said that virtually every disease you have can somehow be treated by paying attention to the diet. You can reduce your weight. A balanced diet can help you through those middle years. Of course, when people start putting away, it was good against arthritis. You needed your vitamins and minerals, what to eat if you have indigestion, etc. So it wasn't unlike many of the diet books that we see advertised on Amazon today and that you see in the bookstores. It purported to have an answer to the dietary problems and the health problems that people have. Now, interestingly enough, Lindlar was very much against processed foods. Again, this is 1920s, and they weren't talking then about ultra-processed foods and all the scientific evidence why we should not be eating those. In those days, there was a lot of concern about processed foods, mainly because of cleanliness. Upton Sinclair had, of course, written his classic book, The Jungle, which described the horrors of the Chicago meat industry, and how rats were running all over the place, and the rats would get mixed in with the food and all of that. So this is what Lindlar railed against. And also, this was the time when food being processed was first being talked about openly. Well, what kind of processing were they talking about? Well, by that time, there were indeed large food processing plants. I mean, Kellogg had started in the late 1800s, and they were producing cereals in the 1920s. They were producing it on a large scale. And Lindlar said that this was not healthy, that all of this processing robbed food of vital nutrients. Exactly the kind of thing that we hear about today. So what was his answer to this? His answer was, stay away from all of this processed food, eat fresh fruits and vegetables. That was his message in 1923. That's what his idea of you are what you eat was built on. And he railed against the processed foods. Well, the processed foods of that era were very similar to what we're talking about today. I mean, Nathan's hot dogs, of course, was already popular, selling for 5 cents at the time. And it is still with us today, not selling for 5 cents. Now they're about $3.50 a hot dog, but although to be fair, when you do price comparisons like that, you also have to take into account inflation and salaries. I mean, yeah, a hot dog may have been 5 cents at that time, but a weekly salary was probably $20. So I'm not sure by comparison, how cheap or expensive it was. But one thing is for sure, that these fast foods, as they were starting to appear then, were not the greatest in terms of nutrition. So he had a lot of the fundamental ideas of nutrition correct. But I think he also overstepped the boundaries by claiming that food was quasi-medicine, that it could cure every disease. As you can see, here are some of the questions that he says would be answered in the book. This is the back cover of the book. What food should I eat to lose weight? What foods can help relieve arthritis? What food can be good against unpleasant breath? What foods are value in relieving bleeding gums? What vegetables are the best practical sources of iron? And all of this. Well, this was a mixture of sense and nonsense. Some of this information was very sound, but it gave the sort of the idea that every ailment could be cured by paying attention to the diet, and that you really didn't need medicine. And that, of course, is not exactly the right picture. But it is true that he was on the right track. I mean, today we see, as I said, almost daily articles like this about how you really are what you eat, and about all of the evils of processed food, right? And very interesting how we have learned about the nuances of what we eat. While of course it is true that food has a tremendous impact on our health. I mean, I think this is just obvious, just considering that it is the only raw material that ever goes into our body. So obviously we are made of the food that, the body is made of the food that we eat. However, there are nuances, because as you can appreciate, if you take two people and you put them on exactly the same diet, you won't have exactly the same outcome, because the diet is only one part of health. Genetics, of course, play a very important part. And as we learn over and over again, so is activity level, which is critical. In fact, there was a paper that just came out today, so you'll probably see it in the news within the next couple of days, which was a pretty good study of the relationship between the progress of cancer and exercise. And the data very clearly show that people who exercise, if they are diagnosed with cancer, the disease progresses much, much more slowly, and they live longer. I mean, this is sort of intuitively obvious. We've known this, but now we have the physical evidence for this. So activity levels are very important. But again, food, activity, and genetics don't account for all impacts on our health. There are other things as well. We hear a great deal these days about chemical exposure, right? I mean, you heard the story about black utensils in your kitchen, about whether or not they're wreaking havoc with your health. We worry about the air that we breathe. We worry about toxins in the environment. And then, of course, there's something else that obviously has a great deal of impact on our health. And those are the microbes. Those are the bacteria and the viruses to which we are exposed. And I mean, obviously, we had a great example of that with the 3 years of COVID that we struggled through, how that can impact our life. So yes, while food is very important, it is only one of the factors that will govern our health outcome. And then, of course, there are decisions that we make as well about risk in our life. Obviously, when you decide to smoke, or when you decide to drink alcohol, or do drugs, or bicycle without a helmet, right? I mean, these are all potential risk factors that we consciously undertake, right? So again, it's important to understand the you are what you eat phenomenon, but it's also important to understand that it is not the only governing feature of health. But there's something else about food. I think it is wrong to have to evaluate every morsel of food that you put into your mouth in terms of, is it good for me or is it not good for me? Because there's more to life than that. Food also should be a source of pleasure, right? I mean, let's face it, we like to eat not only because we need it to survive, but because we also enjoy the food, right? And I think that's a very important feature of life. So yeah, I don't mind occasionally having a smoked meat sandwich. I wouldn't have it every day, right? So enjoyment of food is also important. And interesting enough, Brian Savarin, who we started this discussion with, in his book says, the discovery of a new dish does more for the happiness of mankind than the discovery of a star. Because food really is, you know, so important to our life. But let's face it, we do have to eat because food is the fuel that the body uses. The human body can be thought of as a machine. And like every machine in the world, no matter what kind of machine you're talking about, needs energy input, right? There's no such thing as a machine that can function without any kind of input. I mean, this is just, you know, folly. People who say that they can have a car that can run without gasoline by recirculating exhaust gas or whatever. This is nonsense. Every machine runs with a source of energy, just a question of where that energy comes from. And this is, of course, also true for the human body. Whether we are running or whether we are just sitting and thinking, it requires energy. Everything that happens in our body requires an input of energy. Now, to get back to the analogy of the car, obviously, in that case, the fuel is either gasoline or more and more these days, electricity. Of course, people think of that as two different things. I mean, it really isn't. In many parts of the world, the two are very closely related because electricity is generated by burning petroleum or by burning coal. So you're just displacing where the energy comes from. But the point is that when a car is running, it has to be burning something, right? And we know what happens when you run out of fuel, right? I mean, the car stops. There's no such thing as you know, running a car without any kind of input. However, we now have a very interesting case of a woman in Africa who claims that she has not eaten food for 16 years or has not consumed a drop of water for 16 years. Now, this is a very interesting story. Why? Because, I mean, let's face it, I mean, it's absurd. You know, I don't think that we need to go, you know, into too much detail about such a ridiculous claim. This would transcend the laws of thermodynamics, which will never be repealed. As Einstein so cleverly said, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be changed from one form to another. So when we eat, we're using the energy that is locked in the chemical bonds in the food, and we release that. That's where we get our energy. It is not possible to live without an input of energy. Everything that happens in the body, which together we call metabolism. Now, people are confused about, you know, what that term metabolism means. It just means taking the food that we eat and using it as a source of energy. Basically, the body is a machine that burns food. The end result is carbon dioxide and water, which we exhale, right? That's the end result. But until we do that, the energy is used to run all of the chemical reactions in the body that constitute life. So there's no question that we have to have food in order to survive. We also have to have water in order to survive. And water, in fact, is on the short term, is more critical than its food. We can go much, much longer without food than without water. And as you can see, there are all kinds of reasons why we need water. One obvious is that it regulates your body core temperature. Because if you get too hot, you sweat, and that's what cools down the body. And remember also that every chemical reaction that goes on in the body happens in solution, right? It either happens in the blood, happens in organs, which are bathed in liquid. So water is needed for all kinds of reasons as depicted here. In terms of how long we can go, well, we can go quite a long time, surprisingly, without food. However, you can't go very long without water. 3 to 5 days is really the absolute maximum that you can go without water. Now, when you look at the Guinness Book of Records, which is, of course, a very interesting book to look at, there's an entry in there about Andreas Mihavets, an Austrian man who was forgotten in a prison cell for 18 days without being given any food or water. And he is in there sort of as a record for length of going without water, except that he really didn't go without water. As he himself explained, he licked the water that condensed on the walls of his prison cell. The walls were cool, and of course, there's always moisture in the air that condenses on cold surfaces. So he licked that, and that's how he was able to survive. So he did not go 18 days without water. I said 3 to 5, that's the maximum. Now, in terms of food, this is where it becomes more interesting. The record here, as you can see, is 382 days. And this is recorded. This is not opinion, because Agostino, or Angus Barbieri, Angus is how he was commonly known, battled weight his whole life. And when he finally hit 456 pounds, and he was going to a football game in England and could not get through the turnstile, and they had to open the garage door to let him in, this is when he said, something has to be done. So he underwent a controlled fast, first in a hospital. This was in Dundee in Scotland, and after that at home. And he, of course, was given liquids. He drank coffee, he drank tea, he was given water. That was no problem, but he didn't eat. And the result was, after the 382 days, you can see, pretty impressive, going from 456 to 180 pounds. And the dramatic picture here, the pants that he wore before and the pants that he wore then. And of course, the headlines that were seen around the world was that he had no food for 382 days, world record for fasting. However, this needs an asterisk because it's not exactly correct. When we look at the scientific literature, and here is the case report, because as I said, this was under controlled conditions. You know, he was under doctor's care all the time. And as you can see, where they describe what he had, he was given vitamins every day and also yeast. So he was given yeast. It's not clear how much yeast, but yeast, of course, is a nutrient. It is a food. And it does contain all of the required amino acids. Yeast contains protein, and it has all the required amino acids. We don't know how much he ate. So that's why this 382 days kind of goes with an asterisk because he didn't literally go without any food. He was given yeast, we just don't know how much. He died at a rather young age, 51, and whether or not this, intense fast had a contribution to that, hard to say. I mean, he lived about 5 more years after that. I don't know. So, as I said, the 382 days is not exactly correct. So what is correct? What is documented as having gone the longest without food? Well, that record legitimately belongs to David Blaine, who I think many of you may be familiar with because he really is an outstanding magician. He's a bizarre character, for sure, but I know a bit about magic, and I can tell you that David Blaine is really one of the best that I've ever seen. His sleight of hand is tremendous. But he also likes to partake in these strange feats, like being in an ice cube. This was in Times Square in New York. And for something like 36 hours, he stood inside a cube of ice. I don't know what is the appeal there. I don't know. It's kind of when people enjoy others being in situations that are potentially, dangerous. But anyway, the record-setting starvation was in England, in London. So this is all documented. There's no chance of cheating here, because David was in a plexiglass cage above the Thames River, as you can see, in full view of everyone. So it was clear that he was given no food. The only thing he had was water to drink. Interestingly enough, the onlookers in England weren't really enamored of this stunt. They thought it was crazy. They threw tomatoes at him. They tried to hit him with golf balls. And one guy even had a small helicopter to which he attached a McDonald's hamburger, and he flew it by to taunt him. So anyway, he did do this crazy thing. And for 44 days, he really went on, and he didn't look the same after, as you can see. He lost 54 pounds. He really put himself at risk. I mean, this is dangerous. And he was immediately taken to the hospital when he came out of his box. And there is the hospital record. Yeah. There's the hospital record. And it was not without problems. He was diagnosed with low phosphate levels, hypophosphatemia. And there's a reason for that, because your body behaves differently when you're starving. It doesn't use electrolytes the same way. And when all of a sudden you're given sugars to eat, it requires the electrolytes. And of course, because of starvation, they weren't present in his bloodstream. So he had to have intravenous phosphate anyway. But he eventually recovered. But he spent about a week in the hospital. Since that time, he's engaged in other strange stunts. For example, tying himself to 72 helium-filled balloons and rising up to something like 23,000 feet. So almost to the height of where airplanes fly. And then he parachuted down to safety. I don't know what this demonstrates, but he does these strange things, and he had stunts of being buried alive. But anyway, as far as magic goes, he's very good. But I'm not particularly, enamored of these kind of stunts. So anyway, back to where we started this story about this woman in Ethiopia, who claims that she has not eaten or consumed any kind of liquid for 16 years. Now, this story came to light recently. Why? Because of a documentary that was done by Drew Binsky, who's a very, very legitimate video blogger. He's actually a very interesting guy who travels around the world doing travel videos, very often with, interesting little stories in them. So he certainly is not a quack or is not a fool. He has achieved quite a bit of fame because he has actually visited every country that is registered with the United Nations in the world. And you can follow him if you go on YouTube and look him up, and you'll see he's done some amazing videos. So anyway, he heard of this story in Ethiopia of the woman who claims not to have eaten for 16 years, and he tracked her down. And again, you can find this it's about a 30-minute documentary on YouTube. It's well worth watching. So eventually, he does track her down in a little village in Ethiopia. And she's very clear about her claim that she does not eat and has not eaten. And he interviews the people around her and some of the neighbors, and they claim, I have never seen her eat or drink, and so it sounds kind of compelling. And then she also tells him that she has actually been investigated by physicians, that she had traveled to Kuwait, that she had traveled to Dubai. Why? Because the Prime Minister of Ethiopia heard about her and wanted this, investigated, and actually funded her traveling to these other countries, where she says she was investigated by doctors. Now, this picture appears, in these documentaries. I don't know where that picture comes from, and it could be any doctor anywhere, who knows. So anyway, as proof, she showed Drew her passport with stamps in it from Dubai and I think Saudi Arabia, where she claims that she went and the doctors examined her and found her to be in perfect health. And he kind of buys this and says that, so there's no evidence of fraud. Well, I don't think showing a couple of stamps in a passport is, evidence. But anyway, he stayed with her for 2 days and said that he didn't see her eat or drink. Well, of course, 2 days, anyone can do that, right? Well, wouldn't you think that if someone makes a claim like this, which of course is scientifically impossible because it transcends the laws of nature, that you would have a proper investigation? I mean, this would not be so hard to do. Put her in a hotel room for a week. Let's see what happens, right? We'd shut off the water, etc. Of course, this has not been done. So what is interesting in this story is not that it might be true. Of course, it cannot be true. That's ridiculous. But that there is such a story, that people actually believe that this could be the case. I don't know who's in on it. I mean, maybe all the villagers are in on it too, because it brings tourists there. And she very clearly states in the interview that she wants to be famous, right? I mean, it's really a bizarre story, but I think the real ending here should be Thomas Paine's classic quote: is it more probable that nature should go out of her course or that a man should tell a lie? And I think we know the answer to that. I think this woman who claims that she has not eaten or drank for 16 years, I think we know which category she belongs to, right? Man cannot live without food. That's all there is. We have to eat to survive. Now, of course, there's also the question of how much you have to eat to survive. And this is actually the main problem that we face today nutritionally, at least in the West. is overconsumption. All right? We just eat too much. And it's very obvious. I mean, I can tell you just last winter, we went on a cruise on the Epic of the Seas, the Icon of the Seas, the largest cruise ship in the world, 9,000 people. It was really something. I can say it was an adventure. So anyway, we went on it with it's my daughter and 3 grandsons, and obviously it was so clear about the consumption habit of people. Everything is buffet, and it's just amazing to see, what happens. I don't understand why, when you have a buffet where it is clear that you can take as much as you want and you go back as many times as you want, why would you right away pile everything and take it back to your table? But that's what they do. That's what they do. And, so it seems to be that first they armed themselves by putting all the ammunition, there on the table. And of course, a tremendous amount of it gets left. It's really frightening how much you see thrown out. And the other thing is, and this they do in all buffets, is that the buffet always has to look full, right? Because that's how it becomes appetizing. So you see that as soon as it has gone down, they will come and fill it up, right? Which of course means that at the end of the day, there's a lot that is left over. So what happens to that, right? Well, there's no question, what happens. I guess maybe some of that gets fed to the crew, but most of it, of course, gets thrown out. And this is where it really becomes frightening when we actually look at the numbers. And according to Food and Agriculture Organization in the United Nations, 1/3 of all the food that is produced around the world is wasted. Now, what makes that statistic really awful is that we also know that 1/3 of the world goes hungry every night, right? So if that food were not thrown out, we could feed everyone. The world is capable of producing all the food that is needed. It's just that it doesn't get spread around properly. Now, the other thing to consider is the tremendous amount of energy that is wasted on the wasted food. Because that 1/3 of all the food that we throw out also means that 1/3 of all the fertilizer that was used on that food is wasted. 1/3 of all the pesticides that were used on that on that growing that food is wasted. 1/3 of all the energy that was used to run the pumps that you need to water all of that is wasted. 1/3 of the energy that the tractors and combines use to harvest all of that food, that's all wasted. On top of this, there's a tremendous amount of energy input in the trucks and ships and airplanes that transport the food. Because we're not eating food that's grown in our backyard, right? Right now, we're eating food that comes from South America or whatever. Now, all of this energy that we talk about here, I mean, mostly comes from petroleum, right? I mean, the gasoline that tractors use comes from petroleum. The production of all the fertilizer, all the pesticides, etc., all of that requires energy. And when you take a look at that, there's also the issue of all the greenhouse emissions that come with producing that food. All the tractors running, the ships, and all of that carbon dioxide that is being produced. So when we talk about throwing out 1/3 of all the food that is produced, we're also talking about wasting 1/3 of all of the energy that is needed to produce that food. Now, of course, different foods require different amounts of energy input. Meat, for example, I'm sure you've heard this story, is not an environmentally friendly food to produce. It takes a lot of water, a lot of feed for the animals. For every 1,700 calories per person, the cows only produce 600 calories per person. So that's not a very efficient way of eating. It is much more efficient if instead of feeding, let's say, the corn to the animal, if we eat the corn. So there's no question that a diet that is mostly plant-based is far better for the environment. Much less greenhouse gas production, right? However, we are not going to convert the world into vegetarians. That's not going to happen. Even though, of course, nutritionally speaking, we could do that. There's no longer any doubt about that a balanced vegetarian diet can be as healthy as any other diet. We do not need meat. We eat meat because we like meat. That's the problem. The damn animals taste good, right? But it's not necessary to eat meat. Tofu, for example, is a very, very good substitute. And when you learn how to cook it properly, it can actually taste good. However, this is not the direction that we seem to be going. Because in fact, as the so-called developing world starts to catch up to us, they also want to eat more meat. So China, for example, is consuming much more meat now than they ever did. It's not rice and vegetables in the Chinese diet anymore. Now, as they are getting more and more money, they're eating more and more meat. But the fact is that environmentally, and indeed health-wise, eating less meat is the way that we should be going. And also, what we really do need to pay attention to is what happens to the food that we throw out. Composting is a great idea because eventually all of the organic matter that we throw out can be composted, which means that bacteria in that compost pile break it down into nutrients that can then be used as fertilizer. So composting is great, but it's not quite as simple as people think. You have to have a proper composting facility where they control the temperature, where they turn the compost pile, in order to make it efficient. That little compost pile in the corner of your backyard is not what is going to make the world run. We need this on a much, much larger scale. And when we don't do that, when we don't compost and the food waste ends up in landfill, which usually does, because if you just think of all of the food containers that you throw out, that you brought your supper home in, right, which have remnants in them of food, the whole thing gets thrown out, and the food ends up in the landfill as well. Well, when the food ends up in the landfill, there you have a real problem, because the bacteria in the landfill will decompose the food, and not only do we get methane produced, which is a greenhouse gas, but all of the components of this, some of which can be toxic, eventually leach out and get into groundwater. So the problem of food waste is one that really needs to be addressed, and we really have to start thinking about what we throw out. And one of the problems is that people don't know about dates, like things like the best before date. A lot of people think that the best before date means that at midnight of that day, the food becomes inedible, okay? The best before date, this is very important to understand, the best before date is not anything to do with toxicity. That only has to do with the quality of the food in terms of taste, in terms of texture. So, yeah, it will taste the way you want it to taste before the best before date, and it might slowly degrade after that, but it doesn't make it inedible. On the other hand, if you see expires on such and such a date, that's a different story. Because there you're talking about possible microbial contamination, etc. So no, you should not eat food that says expires. You should not eat it beyond that date. The other problem is that when people go grocery shopping, they look for fruit, vegetables that are unblemished. Blemish does not make it of nutritional poorer quality or even of poorer taste quality. But if you see that, you're likely not going to buy it. Even though cooking with that tomato will be as good as with cooking one that looks perfectly good, and probably it may be even better. It's probably more ripe. And just because that apple has a blemish on it doesn't mean that you should stay away from it. Now, the transport of food these days, it's also an issue in terms of environmentalism. I mean, I must admit, I like to eat my blueberries every morning, and the truth is that they come from far away. They come from Peru. Now, that's an expensive thing to bring it from Peru, not only in terms of money, but just think of the fuel that the airplanes use to transport that from Peru. So I know it's not an environmentally great thing to do. Blueberries are 90% water. We're transporting from Peru something that is 90% water, and water is heavy, right? We're paying for that in fuel. So this is not environmentally friendly, but I do it because I like the taste. I can argue for the nutritional properties of it, and I must say I try to compensate, because when I go to IGA and I buy apples, I do actually buy the ones that have blemishes. And but I was really alerted to all of this on the cruise, and there certainly are problems with the environmentalism way beyond the food wastage on the cruise. I mean, just the energy use on a ship like that is just phenomenal. But then again, life is for the living, so you're not going to evaluate everything in terms of whether it's good or not. The truth is that life is full of difficult decisions, and that's what we have to live with. But maybe next time when you think about what to throw out and what not to throw out, you'll think about it a bit more in terms of the waste. So anyway, we are what we eat, but that eating also has consequences. So that's our story for today, and our next meeting is the first Monday in February. Yeah. Well, look, I mean, we have, if we go back to the Holocaust, I mean, people in Auschwitz survived for a very long period without eating. I mean, under extreme conditions, you can do that. I mean, who the hell knows what is really happening in Gaza? I mean, what the hostages are being fed? We don't know. But anyway, next Monday, we won't have to think about it anymore because Trump is going to fix it all, right? Next Monday, the hostages are liberated because otherwise, as he says, all hell is going to break loose. We'll see. Yeah. The question is about blueberries and frozen blueberries. In terms of nutrition, the frozen ones are fine. I don't particularly like the frozen ones because when you unfreeze them, they become all mushy and liquidy. But if that doesn't bother you, the frozen ones are nutritionally just as good. Yeah. Frozen actually, believe it or not, are often more nutritious than the fresh because they are flash frozen immediately when they're picked, whereas the fresh can lose nutrients during transportation. So yeah, frozen is fine. Canned is usually fine, but with canned, what you have to do is look at the salt content, because obviously, I was just looking, Campbell's soup had a sale at Walmart the other day. I was looking at that, 77 cents a can. That's a pretty attractive price, but it has 750 milligrams of sodium per serving. I mean, that's half of your daily allotment. That's a lot. So yeah, with canned, the first thing to do is to look at the sodium content. She doesn't eat canned? Mm-hmm. Right. So you want to know whether to discard the daughter? Yeah. No, look, I mean, there's really nothing wrong with canned food. But it's one of these things that you want to look at the sum total of sodium that you're getting from all the canned foods. That would be the concern. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I know it can make you crazy. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, I know what you mean, but it is also true that we see more obesity now than we've ever seen. We see more diabetes than we've ever seen. So, yes, that's right. Exactly. There's so much food out there, and so much of it looks appetizing that people don't only eat because they feel hungry, right? You eat because the thing tastes good, right? I mean, let's face it, when you snack at night, as most people do after supper, I mean, why are you doing that? You're not hungry. There would be no problem if you went to bed without having snacked at night. It's just that there's things that taste good and it's entertaining to eat. And this is why people do have success with the so-called intermittent eating, where they will only eat during 8 hours of a day. Well, because if you do that, then automatically you're cutting down on the amount you're going to eat. Because if you're 8 hours that you're going to eat, usually it would be from 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon. I mean, if everything you eat is squeezed into that period, you're not going to be snacking at night. So you're going to be taking in fewer calories. Yeah. Well, no. No, and I don't think that we can look at the scriptures as, as a scientific text. I think the way to look at the scriptures, the way that we, look at fairy tales. It's a series of stories that are embellished and added to whatever. What we know is the longest that any human has ever lived is 122 years. And that's a French lady, Jean Calment, with a birth certificate, so we know this, and that is what defines the human lifespan. The lifespan is what a member of a species can live as a maximum. It's not the same as life expectancy. Life expectancy is the number of years that you're expected to live from birth, right? Lifespan is the maximum that any member of the species has lived. 122 in proper years. Yeah. Takes the water from where? Yeah, okay. Yeah, yeah. So it's basically a dehumidifier coupled to a coffee maker. Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah. I don't know, it sounds like a marketing gimmick. Yeah. The question is difference in nutritional value between greenhouses and grown outdoors. There's no difference. The nutritional content of a food is determined by its genetics, by the amount of fertilizer that is given, not whether it's grown indoors or outdoors. Yeah. Yeah, look, I mean, there's no question that the food supply in the Western world is not ideal. Is that there are certainly issues with processed food. We're not exactly sure why, what it is in the processing, whether it's the extra sugar, the salt, or emulsifiers, or whatever. But anyway, Kennedy is not the first one to come up with this idea that we need a change in food supply. I mean, that's why, I really don't like the idea that some people are giving some credit to this imbecile because he's saying that we should change the food supply. I mean, I hope that there's a chance that he won't get confirmed. I think it's possible because you only need, I think, two or three Republicans to vote against him. I would like to think that not 100% of Republicans are idiots. I mean, it comes close to 100%, but I mean, if it's only 97%, then we may be okay, and he won't get confirmed. We'll see. I mean, if he does, it's going to be a tragedy. Just last week, 17,000 physicians signed a letter protesting against him. So we'll see how it comes out. Yeah. It's possible. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. You can put vitamins in gummies. Yeah. I mean, that's just a technical thing. It's whether you should be taking a supplement in the first place, that's a different question. But yeah, you can do it in gummies. Yes. Some foods can cause mucus. The classic ones are dairy foods, which can do that in some people. Yes, this is true. Yeah. Yeah. Good question. The reason that you get the methane production in a landfill is because this happens under anaerobic conditions. That is when you don't have access to air. This is why I mentioned that in a compost situation, it is important to turn the compost all the time so that there's always air in there. All right, so we'll see you in February.